Maya Chen was wiping down the last table of her late shift at Sunset Diner when a black limousine pulled up outside. From the car stepped an elderly man with silver hair, expensive suit, but shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. He took a seat in the corner booth, ordered black coffee and a piece of toast. Maya noticed he held something in his trembling hand, a tarnished bronze medal that caught the neon light with a dull gleam. When he paid, Maya saw the tremor in his fingers. "Thank you," he whispered, then slid a folded piece of paper toward her. The first words made Maya freeze. "H&W Industries killed my son. Help me prove it." Outside the window, the limousine had already vanished into the night. The fluorescent lights of Sunset Diner buzzed with their familiar electric hum as Maya Chen sprayed disinfectant across the cracked Formica counter. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of closing shifts. The last stragglers nursing cold coffee, the gentle scrape of chairs being stacked, the satisfying click of the register drawer sliding shut. We wonder where you're watching from tonight because maybe you've met someone like Maya, someone whose life was about to change with one unexpected encounter. Her law degree hung unused in her studio apartment, a reminder of dreams deferred by student loans and the harsh reality that even straight-A students from state schools sometimes had to serve pie and coffee to make ends meet. Pete Morrison, the diner's gruff owner and former detective, had given her this job when no law firm would return her calls, and she'd been grateful for his faith in her potential even when she'd stopped believing in it herself. The bronze medal caught the overhead light as Walter Hendricks turned it slowly between his weathered fingers, and Maya found herself studying the old man's face with the careful attention she'd once reserved for case law. His suit was clearly expensive, wool that spoke of corner offices and board meetings, but his eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who had lost everything that mattered. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of an engineer who had spent decades choosing his words with mathematical certainty. "My name is Walter Hendricks," he said, and Maya noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. 2 years ago, my son David worked as an environmental engineer for H&W Industries. He was brilliant, dedicated, the kind of young man who believed science could save the world. The medal, Maya could see now it was an Environmental Achievement Award, seemed to grow heavier in his grip as he continued his story. David Hendricks had discovered something terrible in the company's waste management reports, Walter explained with the methodical clarity of someone who had rehearsed these words countless times. The young engineer had spent months documenting evidence of illegal chemical dumping, tracking contaminated water sources, building an airtight case that would have brought down one of the state's most powerful corporations. Maya's forensic accounting background kicked in automatically as Walter described the paper trail his son had assembled. Falsified EPA reports, bribery documentation, health studies that had been buried or manipulated. She had studied exactly these kinds of environmental fraud cases during her brief time in law school, back when she thought she would spend her career fighting for justice rather than fighting to pay rent. Walter's voice broke slightly as he reached the crucial moment in his narrative. 3 days before David was scheduled to present his findings to federal investigators, he had died in what police ruled a single-car accident on a rainy night. The USB drive Walter placed on the table looked innocuous enough, just a small black rectangle that could have contained vacation photos or work presentations. "Everything David collected is on here," Walter said, his engineer's mind still seeking logical solutions even in the face of overwhelming grief. "Financial records, correspondence, laboratory results that H&W paid to suppress. The encryption is military grade. David learned that in his Army Reserve service, but the password is hidden in his personal journal." Maya found herself leaning forward despite every instinct telling her to walk away from whatever dangerous game this old man was playing. She had seen enough legal thrillers to know that corporations like H&W Industries didn't hesitate to protect their interests, and she had enough student debt to understand why whistleblowers so often found themselves isolated and vulnerable. But something about Walter's quiet dignity reminded her of her own grandfather, an immigrant who had worked construction for 40 years and never stopped believing that America rewarded those who stood up for what was right. Pete Morrison emerged from the kitchen with the night's receipts tucked under his arm. his former cop instincts immediately picking up on the tension at table 7. Maya had worked for him long enough to recognize the subtle shift in his posture, the way his eyes cataloged details without seeming to stare. Walter noticed Pete's attention and nodded respectfully, the gesture of one professional acknowledging another. "You've got a good eye," Walter told Pete quietly. 23 years with Metro PD, if I'm not mistaken. Maya's lucky to have someone watching out for her in a place like this. Pete's expression softened slightly, though he kept his voice neutral when he asked if everything was all right. Maya realized that Walter had done his homework before choosing this diner, before choosing her, and the thought was both reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. The weight of Walter's request settled on Maya's shoulders as she studied the USB drive and the bronze medal side by side on the worn Formica table. Her practical mind cataloged all the reasons to say no. She wasn't a practicing attorney. She had no experience with corporate investigations, and she couldn't afford to lose her job over some conspiracy theory. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that justice delayed was justice denied, and that sometimes ordinary people had to step forward when the system failed. Walter seemed to read her internal struggle with the insight of someone who had spent 2 years learning to recognize doubt and hesitation. "I'm dying," he said simply, without self-pity or dramatic emphasis. "Cancer. 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. I don't need justice for myself. I need it for David, and for all the families whose children will get sick from drinking poisoned water if H&W continues their practices unchecked." Maya's decision crystallized as she watched Walter carefully return the bronze medal to his jacket pocket, treating it like the sacred relic it had become. She thought about her abandoned law books gathering dust, about the forensic accounting skills she'd learned but never used professionally, about the comfortable numbness of serving coffee while the world continued its slow slide toward injustice. Pete caught her eye from behind the counter and gave an almost imperceptible nod, the gesture of a former cop who understood that some fights were worth taking regardless of the odds. Walter stood to leave, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was beginning to betray him, but his handshake was still firm when Maya told him she would help. As the black limousine pulled away into the pre-dawn darkness, Maya found herself holding the USB drive and wondering if she had just committed herself to the most important case of her abbreviated legal career, or simply signed her own death warrant. The diner fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of early morning traffic beginning to build on the interstate. Maya sat alone at table 7, turning Walter's revelations over in her mind with the systematic analysis she'd learned in law school but had never applied to a real case with life and death implications. Pete began his closing routine with practiced efficiency, but she could feel his attention focused on her even as he counted receipts and locked away the night's earnings. The USB drive felt heavier than its few ounces should warrant, loaded as it was with the final testimony of a dead whistleblower and the hopes of a grieving father who had months left to live. Maya Chen had spent 2 years serving pie and coffee while her dreams collected dust, but as she slipped the drive into her purse and prepared to face whatever H&W Industries might throw at her, she felt something she hadn't experienced since law school, the electric anticipation of a fighter who had finally found a worthy opponent. Maya stared at the USB drive on her kitchen counter as morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of her studio apartment, casting long shadows across the stack of unpaid bills that served as her daily reminder of why she served coffee instead of practicing law. Sleep had been impossible after her encounter with Walter Hendricks, her mind cycling through the implications of his request with the relentless precision of a legal brief she couldn't quite complete. The forensic accounting textbooks on her bookshelf, relics from a more optimistic time when she believed education automatically translated into opportunity, seemed to mock her hesitation with their promises of corporate fraud detection and financial crime investigation. She had learned to trace money through complex shell companies and offshore accounts, to spot the telltale patterns of embezzlement and tax evasion, but those skills had remained theoretical exercises until now. The bronze medal haunted her thoughts as she made her morning coffee, its tarnished surface reflecting not just achievement but the weight of a father's love and a son's sacrifice. The decision to return to Sunset Diner during Pete's morning shift felt both inevitable and terrifying as Maya walked through the familiar glass doors that had framed her working life for 2 years. Pete Morrison stood behind the grill with the focused attention of someone who had never quite left police work behind, his spatula moving with the same methodical precision he had once applied to crime scenes and witness interviews. Maya had always sensed there was more to Pete's story than he let on. Former cops didn't usually end up running diners unless they had seen too much of human nature's darker side and needed the healing routine of feeding people instead of arresting them. When she approached the counter with a USB drive in her hand, Pete's expression shifted from morning pleasantries to the alert focus of a detective who recognized the difference between curiosity and genuine trouble. His coffee-stained apron and graying hair couldn't quite disguise the fact that 23 years of police work had given him instincts that civilian life couldn't entirely dull. "That old man last night left you with more than a tip," Pete observed, his voice carrying the neutral tone he had perfected during decades of interviewing witnesses who might be lying or might be in danger. Maya found herself explaining Walter's story with the careful precision she had learned in law school, watching Pete's expression grow more serious as she detailed David Hendricks's environmental investigation and suspicious death. Pete listened without interruption, occasionally nodding in the way of someone who had heard too many stories about good people who asked the wrong questions and paid the ultimate price. When Maya finished her account, Pete poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter with the contemplative stance of a man weighing evidence and calculating odds. "I remember the Hendricks case," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of unsolved mysteries. "Single car accident, rainy night, no witnesses. The investigating officer was thorough, but there wasn't much physical evidence to work with. Just a young man who lost control of his vehicle on a dangerous curve." The encryption on David's USB drive proved as sophisticated as Walter had promised. But Pete's unexpected expertise with computer security reminded Maya that modern police work required technological skills alongside traditional investigative techniques. Pete's basement office, a cramped space behind the diner's kitchen that smelled of coffee grounds and old paperwork, contained equipment that belonged in a detective bureau rather than a restaurant, and Maya began to understand why her boss had been so willing to hire a failed law student with no food service experience. Pete worked with the patient focus of someone who had learned that rushing usually meant missing crucial details, his fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising dexterity for someone whose hands were more accustomed to flipping pancakes than typing passwords. When the files finally opened, revealing David Hendricks's meticulously organized evidence of H&W Industries' environmental crimes, Maya felt the familiar rush of intellectual excitement that had originally drawn her to law, the moment when seemingly random facts suddenly arranged themselves into an unshakable pattern of proof. David Hendricks had been extraordinarily thorough in documenting H&W Industries' systematic violations of federal environmental law, his engineering background evident in the precise measurements and chemical analyses that filled folder after folder of digital evidence. Maya's forensic accounting training allowed her to recognize the financial patterns underlying the environmental crimes. Shell companies created to hide waste disposal costs, bribes disguised as consulting fees, and insurance policies that seemed designed to profit from environmental disasters rather than prevent them. The young engineer had traced contaminated groundwater to its source, documented cancer clusters in surrounding communities, and compiled testimony from workers who had been ordered to falsify safety reports. Pete studied the financial documents with the methodical attention of someone who had spent years following money trails in criminal investigations, occasionally whistling softly when particularly egregious examples of corporate malfeasance became clear. "Your boy David was building a RICO case," Pete said admiringly, referring to the federal racketeering statutes that allowed prosecutors to treat systematic criminal behavior as organized conspiracy. The revelation that Walter Hendricks had only months left to live transformed Maya's internal debate from academic exercise to moral imperative, the ticking clock of terminal cancer lending urgency to questions of justice and accountability. Pete's expression grew thoughtful as Maya explained Walter's prognosis, his former cop instincts clearly calculating the psychological pressure that drove a dying man to seek closure for his murdered son. The bronze medal represented more than just David's environmental achievement. It symbolized a father's need to transform grief into meaningful action, to ensure that his son's death served some larger purpose in the fight against corporate criminality. Maya found herself thinking about her own parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their daughter opportunities they had never enjoyed. And she wondered if she had been hiding behind financial necessity when the real issue was her fear of failure. The student loans and unpaid bills that had seemed like insurmountable obstacles suddenly felt less important than the possibility of using her education for its intended purpose, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves from those who held power without conscience. Pete's decision to help with the investigation surprised Maya until she remembered that good cops never really retired. They just found new ways to serve and protect communities that needed their expertise. His contacts within law enforcement and regulatory agencies would prove invaluable in verifying David's evidence and building a case that could withstand H&W Industries' inevitable counterattack, while his understanding of criminal procedure would help Maya avoid the legal pitfalls that had probably trapped previous whistleblowers. The diner's back office became an unlikely war room as they spread David's files across Pete's desk, creating a timeline of environmental crimes that stretched back over a decade and implicated not just H&W but several government officials who had accepted bribes in exchange for regulatory approval. Maya felt her dormant legal skills awakening as she studied the evidence, her mind automatically organizing facts and precedents into the framework of a federal case that could bring down one of the state's most powerful corporations. The USB drive that had seemed like a burden 12 hours earlier now felt like a weapon capable of cutting through years of corporate lies and governmental corruption. Walter's phone call that afternoon carried the weight of a dying man's desperate hope, his voice trembling with exhaustion and medication, but still carrying the dignified determination that had impressed Maya during their first meeting. He provided additional context for David's investigation, explaining how his son had grown increasingly paranoid in the weeks before his death, convinced that H&W executives were monitoring his communications and following his movements. The young engineer had taken extraordinary precautions to protect his evidence, creating multiple copies and establishing secure communication channels that reflected military training as much as environmental expertise. Walter's engineer's mind had spent 2 years analyzing every detail of his son's death, and he had reached the unavoidable conclusion that the car accident was neither accidental nor coincidental. It was murder disguised as misfortune, corporate assassination carried out with the precision of a military operation. As Maya listened to Walter's methodical recitation of evidence, she realized that her role was not just to validate David's research, but to complete an investigation that had been interrupted by cold-blooded killing designed to protect billion-dollar profits at the cost of human lives and environmental destruction. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her interview suit, the same navy blazer she had worn to dozens of fruitless law firm meetings, outside the glass towers of Meridian Financial Services, the accounting firm that handled H&W Industries' regulatory compliance and audit work. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Maya found herself thinking about cycles and seasons, about how corporate crimes often followed predictable patterns that forensic accountants could track if they knew where to look. Her resume had been carefully crafted to emphasize her forensic accounting background while downplaying her recent employment history, Pete's connections in the business community having provided the references necessary to secure this interview for a junior auditor position. The bronze medal seemed to weigh heavily in her thoughts as she rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. David Hendricks's dedication to environmental justice serving as both inspiration and reminder of the dangers that awaited those who dared to challenge powerful interests. Maya had spent the previous evening studying H&W Industries' public financial statements, noting the carefully sanitized language that described environmental compliance costs and regulatory settlements, without acknowledging the human suffering those euphemisms represented. The Meridian offices reflected the sterile prosperity of modern corporate accounting, all glass partitions and ergonomic furniture designed to project an image of efficiency and transparency that Maya had learned to distrust during her forensic training. Rebecca Chang, the senior manager conducting her interview, possessed the sharp intelligence and subtle wariness of someone who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of corporate finance, where loyalty was measured in billable hours and discretion was valued above conscience. Maya answered questions about her academic background and technical skills with practiced professionalism. But she found herself studying Rebecca's reactions for signs of the moral compromise that working with companies like H&W Industries inevitably required. The conversation turned to specific clients and audit procedures, and Maya felt her pulse quicken when Rebecca mentioned H&W's upcoming quarterly review, the perfect opportunity to examine the financial records that David Hendricks had died trying to expose. Rebecca seemed impressed by Maya's knowledge of environmental accounting standards, unaware that her new hire's expertise came from studying the very crimes she was being hired to help conceal. Maya's first day at Meridian began with the tedious process of security clearances and computer access, the modern ritual of corporate onboarding that granted her legitimate access to the files that David Hendricks had risked his life to obtain illegally. The H&W Industries audit team occupied a corner of the floor where natural light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Maya found herself assigned to a cubicle with a direct view of the corporate towers where Richard Warner and his executives made decisions that poisoned groundwater and destroyed communities for quarterly profit margins. Her supervisor, Tom Bradley, was a 15-year veteran of environmental auditing who had developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too many companies treat regulatory fines as routine business expenses rather than deterrents to criminal behavior. Tom's introduction to H&W's accounting practices carried the weary tone of someone who had learned to focus on procedural compliance rather than moral implications, his professional survival dependent on maintaining willful blindness to the larger patterns of fraud and environmental destruction. The H&W Industries financial files revealed a sophisticated system of corporate money laundering that impressed Maya even as it disgusted her. The elegant complexity of shell companies and offshore accounts demonstrating the same kind of engineering precision that David Hendricks had applied to environmental protection. Maya's forensic accounting training allowed her to recognize the telltale patterns immediately: consulting payments to companies that provided no apparent services, maintenance contracts with waste disposal firms that existed only on paper, and insurance policies that seemed designed to profit from environmental disasters rather than prevent them. Each transaction appeared legitimate in isolation, but the cumulative pattern revealed a systematic effort to hide the true costs of H&W's environmental crimes from regulators and shareholders alike. Maya found herself working late into the evening, ostensibly to demonstrate dedication to her new job, but actually to photograph financial documents and trace money flows, without arousing suspicion from her colleagues or the security cameras that monitored every corner of the office. The discovery of Project Greenwater in H&W's restricted files felt like finding the missing piece of a vast puzzle that David Hendricks had died trying to solve. The innocent-sounding name, concealing a massive scheme to dump industrial chemicals into protected watershed areas while bribing local officials to falsify water quality reports. Maya's heart raced as she accessed folder after folder of internal communications, technical reports, and financial projections that treated environmental destruction as a routine business problem requiring creative accounting solutions rather than ethical oversight. The project files revealed the full scope of H&W's criminal enterprise, not just illegal dumping but systematic bribery of EPA officials, manipulation of scientific studies, and intimidation of whistleblowers who threatened to expose the truth. Maya understood now why David Hendricks had been killed. His environmental expertise and moral courage had made him uniquely dangerous to a conspiracy that depended on technical complexity and regulatory capture to avoid accountability for crimes that affected thousands of innocent families. The name Sarah Chen appeared repeatedly in H&W's legal correspondence, and Maya's breath caught as she recognized her own surname attached to a Manhattan law firm that specialized in environmental defense litigation. Maya had lost touch with her younger sister after Sarah graduated from law school and disappeared into the high-pressure world of corporate legal practice, their relationship strained by philosophical differences about whether the legal system served justice or merely protected wealth and power. The documents revealed that Sarah Chen of Blackstone & Associates had been instrumental in crafting H&W's legal strategy for defending against environmental lawsuits. her expertise in toxic tort litigation helping the company minimize financial exposure while maximizing delay and confusion in cases brought by victims of contaminated groundwater. Maya stared at her sister's name on legal briefs that dismissed cancer clusters as statistical anomalies and defended corporate rights to profit from environmental destruction, wondering if Sarah knew the human cost of her professional success, or had simply learned to compartmentalize moral concerns as irrelevant to legal strategy. The weight of corporate surveillance became apparent as Maya noticed the subtle signs of monitoring that David Hendricks had probably recognized too late to save his life. Keylogger software on audit computers, security cameras positioned to record screen activity, and colleagues who asked casual questions designed to probe her true interests and motivations. Tom Bradley's friendly inquiries about her background and career goals carried the undertones of someone who had been asked to evaluate new employees for potential security risks. His questions probing her financial situation and personal relationships with the systematic thoroughness of a counterintelligence operation. Maya realized that H&W Industries had learned from David's investigation, implementing security measures designed to identify and neutralize future whistleblowers before they could assemble enough evidence to threaten the company's criminal enterprise. The bronze medal that Walter carried seemed to represent not just his son's achievement, but the target that David had painted on himself by pursuing environmental justice in a system designed to protect corporate criminals at the expense of public health. Maya's evening routine of copying files and analyzing financial patterns became an exercise in controlled paranoia as she learned to vary her schedule and methods to avoid establishing predictable patterns that security personnel might notice. Pete's training in surveillance detection proved invaluable as he taught Maya to recognize the signs of corporate intelligence gathering. The same techniques that law enforcement used to monitor criminal organizations, now deployed by those same criminal organizations to monitor their own employees and potential threats. The irony was not lost on Maya that she was using legitimate audit procedures to uncover evidence of the same crimes that David Hendricks had been investigating when H&W decided that murder was a more efficient solution than compliance with environmental law. Each document she photographed and each financial pattern she identified brought her closer to completing David's work, but also deeper into the crosshairs of a corporation that had already proven its willingness to kill to protect its secrets. Maya's investigation into H&W Industries' financial labyrinth began to reveal patterns that made David Hendricks' murder seem not just probable, but inevitable. The systematic nature of the company's crimes requiring the kind of comprehensive cover-up that could only be maintained through intimidation and violence. Working late in Meridian's empty offices, Maya traced wire transfers through a network of shell companies that stretched from Delaware incorporation mills to Cayman Islands banks. Each transaction designed to obscure the true purpose of payments that funded everything from false scientific studies to the assassination of environmental whistleblowers. Her forensic accounting skills proved invaluable in decoding the corporate hieroglyphics that disguised bribes as consulting fees and murder contracts as security services. The elegant complexity of the money laundering operation revealing an organization that treated human life as just another line item in their cost-benefit analysis. Pete's law enforcement contacts provided crucial context for the financial patterns Maya discovered, his former colleagues in financial crimes units helping her understand how corporations like H&W used legitimate banking infrastructure to fund criminal enterprises that operated with the precision and ruthlessness of organized crime families. The paper trail that David Hendricks had begun to assemble led Maya deeper into a conspiracy that involved not just H&W Industries, but a network of regulatory officials, scientific consultants, and legal firms that had spent decades perfecting the art of environmental crime and regulatory capture. Maya's discovery of EPA correspondence in H&W's files revealed a systematic pattern of bribery and influence peddling that extended from local water quality inspectors to senior federal officials responsible for enforcing environmental law. The corruption so pervasive that honest regulators found themselves isolated and ineffective in agencies captured by the industries they were supposed to oversee. The bronze medal that haunted Walter's grief represented more than David's environmental achievement. It symbolized the naive belief that scientific truth and regulatory integrity could overcome corporate power and political corruption. A faith that had cost the young engineer his life when he underestimated the lengths to which H&W would go to protect their criminal enterprise. Maya found herself working with the focused intensity of someone who understood that her investigation was not just about justice for David Hendricks, but about exposing a system of institutionalized environmental crime that threatened the health and safety of countless innocent families. Rachel Morrison's name appeared in H&W's internal communications as a problem journalist, whose investigation into cancer clusters near company facilities had been neutralized through a combination of legal intimidation and character assassination. The same playbook that H&W had used against previous whistleblowers before escalating to murder in David's case. Maya's phone call to Rachel revealed a woman whose career had been destroyed by her refusal to ignore the environmental crimes that H&W committed with impunity. Her journalism credentials blacklisted after she published articles connecting company waste disposal practices to childhood leukemia rates in surrounding communities. Rachel's voice carried the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned that investigative journalism was a luxury that few news organizations could afford when faced with H&W's army of corporate lawyers and their willingness to file frivolous lawsuits designed to bankrupt media companies through legal fees rather than actual damages. The meeting Maya arranged with Rachel took place in a downtown coffee shop where the former journalist explained how H&W's crisis management strategy involved not just silencing critics, but destroying their credibility and financial stability to serve as warnings to other potential whistleblowers. The evidence that Rachel provided filled in crucial gaps in David's investigation, her journalistic research complementing his environmental engineering expertise to create a comprehensive picture of H&W's systematic poisoning of groundwater supplies across 3 states. Rachel's files contained testimony from workers who had been ordered to falsify safety reports, medical records linking H&W facilities to cancer clusters, and correspondence revealing how the company had purchased silence from victims' families through confidential settlement agreements designed to prevent public disclosure of environmental crimes. Maya realized that David's murder had been part of a broader strategy to eliminate anyone with the expertise and integrity necessary to challenge H&W's environmental crimes. The company's security consultants systematically identifying and neutralizing threats before they could assemble enough evidence to trigger federal prosecution. Rachel's survival had depended on her decision to retreat from investigative journalism after H&W destroyed her reputation and financial stability. But her files contained the missing pieces that Maya needed to complete David's case and transform circumstantial evidence into prosecutable crimes. The revelation that Sarah Chen was Maya's estranged sister added personal stakes to an investigation that had already consumed Maya's professional and moral identity, the discovery forcing her to confront the possibility that her own family had been complicit in the crime she was trying to expose. Maya's late-night phone call to Sarah began as a sisterly attempt at reconnection, but quickly devolved into a confrontation about the moral implications of defending companies like H&W Industries against environmental lawsuits filed by cancer victims and poisoned communities. Sarah's voice carried the defensive anger of someone who had spent years rationalizing her role in a legal system that protected corporate criminals while denying justice to their victims. Her arguments about zealous advocacy and client confidentiality sounding hollow when weighed against the human cost of H&W's environmental crimes. The conversation ended with Sarah's warning that Maya was playing with forces beyond her understanding, a statement that revealed her sister's knowledge of H&W's willingness to use violence against threats to their criminal enterprise, while simultaneously serving as a threat designed to protect Maya from the consequences of her investigation. Maya's analysis of H&W's insurance policies revealed the most disturbing aspect of the company's criminal enterprise: their systematic planning for environmental disasters and whistleblower assassinations, treating both as predictable business risks that could be managed through appropriate financial instruments and security measures. The insurance coverage for key personnel protection and crisis management services provided clear evidence that H&W had institutionalized murder as a business practice, their policies covering everything from private security consultants to legal defense funds for executives charged with environmental crimes. Maya's forensic accounting background allowed her to recognize the telltale patterns of companies that planned for criminal prosecution as a routine business expense. Their financial projections, including line items for regulatory fines, civil settlements, and witness intimidation that revealed a corporate culture where environmental crime was not an unfortunate accident, but a deliberate strategy for maximizing profits regardless of human cost. The bronze medal seemed to grow heavier in Maya's thoughts as she understood the full scope of the criminal organization that had killed David Hendricks. Their sophistication and resources making her own investigation seem both crucial and terrifyingly dangerous. Pete's surveillance detection training became essential as Maya noticed signs that H&W had identified her as a potential threat. The same security measures that had failed to protect David now focused on determining whether his father's quest for justice posed a continuing risk to the company's criminal enterprise. Maya's colleagues at Meridian began asking pointed questions about her work habits and research interests. Their casual inquiries revealing the systematic monitoring that H&W used to identify potential whistleblowers before they could assemble enough evidence to threaten the company's operations. The paranoia that had consumed David's final weeks began to affect Maya as well, her understanding of H&W's security capabilities making every phone call and email a potential source of intelligence for corporate assassins who treated murder as a routine business problem requiring efficient solutions. Rachel's journalism experience proved invaluable in helping Maya understand how to communicate securely and document evidence in ways that would survive attempts at suppression or destruction. The skills that investigative reporters use to protect sources and preserve evidence translating directly to the challenges facing environmental whistleblowers who dared to challenge corporate power with scientific truth and moral courage. The financial timeline that Maya assembled revealed H&W's escalating security costs in the months leading up to David's murder. The company's payments to private military contractors and crisis management consultants increasing dramatically as David's investigation approached completion. Maya's forensic analysis showed clear correlations between David's research milestones and H&W's expenditures on witness intimidation and information suppression, the company's financial records serving as a roadmap to their criminal activities and their systematic elimination of threats to their environmental crimes. Walter's grief took on new dimensions as Maya understood that his son had been murdered not in a moment of corporate panic, but as part of a carefully planned operation designed to protect billions of dollars in illegal profits from environmental destruction that continued to poison communities across multiple states. The USB drive that Walter had entrusted to Maya contained not just evidence of environmental crimes, but proof of a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond H&W Industries to include federal regulators, scientific consultants, and legal professionals who had transformed environmental protection into an elaborate criminal enterprise that profited from the systematic poisoning of American families and communities. The call to Richard Warner's office came on a Tuesday morning when Maya least expected it. The polite but insistent tone of his executive assistant making it clear that this was not a request but a summons that carried the weight of corporate authority and barely concealed threat. Maya's hands trembled as she rode the elevator to the 43rd floor of H&W Industries headquarters. The same building she had studied from Meridian's windows now surrounding her with marble lobbies and executive conference rooms designed to intimidate visitors with displays of wealth and power. The bronze medal seemed to pulse in her thoughts as she prepared to face the man who had ordered David Hendricks's murder. Walter's son transformed from environmental engineer to corporate casualty by a CEO who treated human life as just another variable in his profit calculations. Maya's legal training kicked in automatically as she reviewed the evidence she had assembled over the past weeks. The financial documents and witness testimony that connected H&W's environmental crimes to a broader pattern of corruption and violence that extended from local water districts to federal regulatory agencies. The recording device hidden in her jacket pocket, a precaution Pete had insisted upon despite the legal risks, would capture whatever threats or admissions Warner made during their confrontation. Richard Warner's corner office reflected the sterile prosperity of corporate power, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city that H&W had been systematically poisoning for decades, while regulatory agencies looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions and lucrative consulting contracts. Warner himself possessed the polished confidence of someone who had spent his career insulating himself from the consequences of his decisions through layers of corporate structure and legal protection. His expensive suit and manicured appearance masking the moral emptiness that allowed him to order murders with the same casual authority he might use to approve marketing budgets. Maya found herself studying Warner's face for signs of the humanity that environmental crimes had corrupted. wondering if he ever thought about the children who had developed cancer from drinking water contaminated by his company's illegal dumping practices. The conversation began with polite inquiries about Maya's work at Meridian and her satisfaction with the audit process, Warner's voice carrying the practiced warmth of a predator who had learned to put his prey at ease before revealing his true intentions. The shift in Warner's demeanor came when Maya mentioned her interest in environmental accounting standards, his expression hardening as he realized that her presence in his office was not coincidental, but the result of an investigation that threatened his carefully constructed criminal empire. Warner's questions became more pointed as he probed Maya's background and motivations, his corporate security training evident in the systematic way he sought to identify the scope of her knowledge and the extent of her evidence against H&W Industries. Maya felt the weight of David Hendricks's sacrifice as she deflected Warner's inquiries with carefully prepared responses that revealed enough to demonstrate her credibility without exposing the full extent of her investigation or the network of allies who were helping her pursue justice for environmental crimes. Warner's office suddenly felt smaller and more dangerous as Maya realized that she was sitting across from someone who had ordered at least one murder and would not hesitate to order another if he perceived her as an existential threat to his company's criminal operations. The job offer that Warner presented carried all the hallmarks of attempted bribery disguised as corporate generosity. His proposal to hire Maya as H&W's chief environmental compliance officer, accompanied by a salary that would eliminate her student debt and provide the financial security that had eluded her since law school. Warner's pitch was carefully crafted to appeal to Maya's professional ambitions and personal vulnerabilities, his understanding of her financial struggles revealing the thorough background investigation that H&W conducted on potential threats to their corporate interests. Maya found herself thinking about the comfortable life that Warner's money could provide, the relief from financial stress that would allow her to focus on legitimate legal work rather than dangerous investigations into corporate murder and environmental crime. The bronze medal seemed to weigh heavier in her thoughts as she considered the moral cost of accepting Warner's offer, David Hendricks's integrity serving as a reminder that some prices were too high to pay regardless of the financial benefits they might provide. Maya's rejection of Warner's offer triggered a transformation in the CEO's demeanor that revealed the calculating ruthlessness that had built H&W Industries into a criminal organization capable of systematic environmental destruction and targeted assassination of whistleblowers. Warner's voice lost its practiced warmth as he explained the risks that environmental activists faced in their crusade against corporate prosperity. His words carefully chosen to sound like friendly advice, while functioning as clear threats against anyone who might challenge H&W's criminal activities. The conversation took on the surreal quality of a negotiation between predator and prey, Warner's corporate training allowing him to discuss murder and intimidation in the sanitized language of risk management and security protocols that transformed criminal conspiracy into routine business operations. Maya's legal background helped her recognize the sophisticated nature of Warner's threats, his careful avoidance of explicitly criminal language demonstrating the same attention to legal detail that had allowed H&W to operate their environmental crimes with virtual impunity for decades. The revelation that H&W had been monitoring Maya's activities since her first day at Meridian added a new dimension of paranoia to an investigation that had already consumed her personal and professional life. Warner's casual references to her daily routine and personal relationships demonstrating the comprehensive surveillance capabilities that corporate criminals could deploy against potential threats. Maya's apartment had been searched, her phone calls monitored, and her financial records analyzed by private intelligence contractors who sold their services to corporations willing to pay premium rates for witness intimidation and evidence suppression. The systematic nature of H&W's security operations revealed an organization that had institutionalized criminal behavior at every level, their ability to monitor and neutralize threats explaining how they had operated environmental crimes for decades without facing serious legal consequences. Warner's description of H&W's security capabilities served as both threat and warning, his corporate euphemisms unable to disguise the fact that Maya was now a target of the same criminal organization that had murdered David Hendricks for pursuing environmental justice. The ultimatum that Warner delivered carried the weight of corporate power backed by demonstrated willingness to use violence against environmental activists who threatened H&W's criminal operations. His 48-hour deadline designed to maximize psychological pressure while providing plausible deniability for whatever actions might follow Maya's refusal to cooperate. Maya understood that her choice was not simply between cooperation and defiance, but between moral compromise and potential martyrdom. The same decision that David Hendricks had faced before H&W security contractors arranged his accidental death on a rainy night 2 years earlier. Warner's confidence reflected his experience with environmental activists who had chosen personal safety over public accountability, their silence purchased through a combination of financial incentives and credible threats that had protected H&W's criminal enterprise for decades. The recording device in Maya's pocket captured Warner's carefully worded threats, but Maya knew that corporate lawyers had perfected the art of criminal communication that avoided explicit confessions while clearly conveying violent intentions to their intended targets. Maya's departure from Warner's office felt like escaping from a predator's den. The marble lobbies and executive conference rooms that had initially impressed her, now seeming like elaborate stage sets designed to mask the moral corruption that funded H&W's corporate prosperity. The elevator ride to ground level provided 43 floors of reflection on the choice that confronted her. Warner's ultimatum forcing her to weigh personal safety against the justice that Walter Hendricks deserved for his murdered son. The bronze medal seemed to pulse in her thoughts as Maya emerged onto the street. David's environmental achievement serving as a reminder that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost they might exact from those brave enough to stand up to corporate power. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Pete warning that H&W security vehicles had been spotted near the diner. The corporate surveillance that Warner had described already shifting from monitoring to active intimidation designed to pressure Maya into accepting the CEO's terms before his deadline expired, and more direct measures became necessary to protect H&W's environmental crimes from exposure. The FBI field office buzzed with controlled urgency as Maya arrived with Rachel Morrison and a collection of evidence that would transform 2 years of grief into the largest environmental crime prosecution in federal history. The carefully assembled documents and recordings representing not just David Hendricks's final testimony, but the systematic exposure of corporate criminality that had operated with impunity for decades. Agent Sarah Chen's presence in the conference room sent shockwaves through Maya's already strained emotional equilibrium. The sister she had lost to corporate law enforcement now revealed as an undercover federal investigator who had spent 3 years infiltrating H&W Industries' legal defense network to build a case from the inside. Sarah's explanation of her deep cover assignment recontextualized years of family estrangement as necessary operational security, her apparent moral compromise in defending environmental criminals actually serving a larger purpose of gathering evidence that could bring down the entire criminal conspiracy. The bronze medal that had haunted Walter's grief seemed to shimmer with new meaning as Maya realized that David's death had not been in vain, but had catalyzed a federal investigation that would finally hold H&W Industries accountable for decades of systematic environmental destruction and targeted violence against whistleblowers. The evidence presentation that Maya and Sarah orchestrated for federal prosecutors resembled a masterclass in corporate crime investigation. Their combined expertise in forensic accounting and environmental law revealing the elegant complexity of H&W's criminal enterprise with scientific precision and legal clarity. Maya's financial analysis demonstrated how shell companies and offshore accounts had been used to fund everything from EPA bribery to contract killings, while Sarah's insider knowledge provided crucial context about H&W's decision-making processes and their systematic elimination of threats to corporate profitability. Rachel Morrison's journalistic research filled in the human dimension of H&W's crimes, her interviews with cancer victims and contaminated communities providing emotional weight to balance the technical complexity of environmental fraud and regulatory capture. The prosecutorial team listened with the focused attention of federal attorneys who understood that they were witnessing the construction of a RICO case that could dismantle one of the most sophisticated corporate criminal organizations in American history. Their questions revealing both professional excitement and moral outrage at the scope of H&W's environmental crimes. The coordinated raids on H&W Industries facilities began at dawn on a Thursday morning when federal agents armed with search warrants descended simultaneously on corporate headquarters, manufacturing plants, and executive residences with the precision of a military operation designed to prevent evidence destruction and witness intimidation. Maya watched from the FBI command center as live video feeds showed agents seizing computers, financial records, and communication devices from executives who had spent decades believing their wealth and corporate structure provided immunity from criminal prosecution. Warner's arrest in his corner office carried particular satisfaction for Maya, the CEO's shocked expression revealing his genuine surprise that federal law enforcement had penetrated the layers of legal protection and political influence that had shielded H&W's criminal activities for so long. The bronze medal seemed to pulse with vindication as Maya witnessed the systematic dismantling of the criminal organization that had murdered David Hendricks. Walter's son finally receiving the justice that 2 years of grief and investigation had made possible through the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept corporate impunity as inevitable. The emergency board meeting at H&W Industries descended into chaos as executives realized that their carefully constructed criminal conspiracy was collapsing under federal scrutiny. Their decades of environmental crimes and systematic violence finally exposed to public accountability through the persistence of a grieving father and a determined forensic accountant. Maya's testimony to the board carried the weight of scientific evidence and moral authority, her presentation of financial documents and witness statements methodically destroying H&W's claims of regulatory compliance and environmental responsibility. The recording of Warner's threats played through conference room speakers with devastating effect. His carefully worded intimidation tactics, stripped of corporate euphemisms, to reveal the crude reality of criminal conspiracy and witness intimidation that had protected H&W's environmental crimes for decades. Sarah's revelation of her FBI identity sent additional shockwaves through the remaining executives. Their realization that federal investigators had been monitoring their criminal activities from inside their own legal defense network, triggering a cascade of plea bargaining and cooperation agreements that would ensure comprehensive prosecution of the entire criminal organization. The media frenzy that erupted following H&W's collapse transformed Maya from anonymous auditor to reluctant spokesperson for environmental justice. Her careful explanations of forensic accounting techniques and corporate crime investigation serving to educate the public about the sophisticated methods that corporations use to hide systematic criminality from regulatory oversight. News organizations across the country picked up the story of the waitress who brought down a corporate criminal empire, though Maya insisted that credit belonged to David Hendricks, whose courage and integrity had made the investigation possible even after his murder by corporate assassins. Rachel Morrison's return to investigative journalism provided expert analysis of H&W's criminal methods and their implications for environmental protection and corporate accountability. Her articles explaining how regulatory capture and witness intimidation had allowed systematic environmental crimes to operate with virtual impunity until federal law enforcement finally penetrated the layers of corruption and violence that protected corporate criminals. The bronze medal that had symbolized David's achievement in life now represented his posthumous victory over the corporate power that had tried to silence environmental truth through murder and intimidation. Walter Hendricks's final public appearance took place in the federal courthouse where H&W executives faced sentencing for environmental crimes and conspiracy charges. His quiet dignity providing stark contrast to the corporate arrogance that had characterized the defendants throughout their criminal careers. Maya sat beside Walter as the judge delivered sentences that would ensure the executives spent their remaining years in federal prison. Their wealth and corporate structure finally proving insufficient protection against criminal prosecution supported by overwhelming evidence of systematic environmental destruction and targeted violence against whistleblowers. Walter's statement to the court avoided vindictive triumph in favor of measured reflection on the human cost of corporate criminality. His words honoring David's memory while acknowledging the broader community of victims whose health and safety had been sacrificed to H&W's pursuit of illegal profits. The bronze medal caught courtroom light as Walter spoke about his son's dedication to environmental protection, the tarnished surface reflecting both grief and justice in equal measure as David's final testimony achieved the accountability that his murder had been designed to prevent. The financial restitution ordered by federal courts would provide compensation to thousands of cancer victims and contaminated communities, though Maya understood that no amount of money could truly restore the lives destroyed by H&W's systematic poisoning of groundwater and deliberate suppression of scientific evidence about environmental health risks. Maya's role in administrating the Victim Compensation Fund represented a continuation of her forensic accounting work in service of environmental justice. Her expertise in corporate finance now directed toward ensuring that H&W's seized assets reached the families who had suffered from decades of criminal environmental destruction. Sarah's transition from undercover agent to environmental prosecutor reflected the federal government's commitment to preventing future corporate environmental crimes through aggressive prosecution and regulatory reform. Her insider knowledge of corporate criminal methods informing new investigative techniques and legal strategies. The David Hendricks Environmental Justice Foundation, established with part of the restitution funds, would provide ongoing support for whistleblowers and environmental activists who dared to challenge corporate power, ensuring that David's courage would inspire future generations of environmental protectors who refused to accept systematic ecological destruction as the inevitable cost of corporate prosperity. The bankruptcy proceedings that dismantled H&W Industries unfolded with the methodical precision of corporate autopsy, federal officials and court-appointed administrators dissecting decades of environmental crime to ensure that every asset could be liquidated for victim compensation and ecological restoration. Maya found herself appointed as forensic accounting supervisor for the asset recovery process, her expertise in corporate financial structures proving essential for tracking down the offshore accounts and shell companies that H&W executives had used to hide stolen profits from environmental destruction and regulatory fraud. The bronze medal seemed lighter in Walter's grip during their weekly meetings at the bankruptcy courthouse. David's posthumous victory over corporate criminality providing the closure that 2 years of grief and investigation had sought through the patient accumulation of evidence and the courage to confront institutional power. The liquidation process revealed the true scope of H&W's wealth. Billions of dollars in assets that had been built on systematic poisoning of communities and deliberate suppression of scientific evidence about environmental health risks. The corporate prosperity finally redirected toward healing the damage that criminal negligence had inflicted on innocent families across multiple states. The law firm of Morrison, Chen & Associates occupied a modest downtown office that reflected Maya's commitment to environmental justice over corporate profit. The practice she established with Rachel Morrison, focusing exclusively on representing communities affected by industrial pollution and regulatory capture. Maya's transition from failed law student to environmental attorney felt like completing a circle that had begun with David Hendricks's murder and Walter's desperate plea for justice in a late-night diner. Her forensic accounting skills finally applied to their intended purpose of protecting vulnerable communities from corporate exploitation and governmental indifference. The bronze medal now held a place of honor in Maya's office reception area. David's environmental achievement serving as daily reminder that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption when backed by scientific evidence and moral determination. Rachel's investigative journalism background proved invaluable in building cases against other environmental criminals. Her ability to uncover corporate cover-ups and regulatory failures, providing the foundation for legal strategies that held polluting industries accountable for their systematic destruction of public health and ecological integrity. Walter Hendricks spent his remaining months working with Maya to establish protocols and funding mechanisms that would ensure the David Hendricks Environmental Justice Foundation could continue supporting whistleblowers and environmental activists long after his death. His engineer's mind finding comfort in systematic planning that would extend his son's legacy into future battles against corporate environmental crime. The Foundation's offices occupied space adjacent to Maya's law practice, their collaborative approach to environmental protection reflecting Walter's belief that lasting change required both legal accountability and ongoing vigilance against corporate attempts to resurrect the regulatory capture and witness intimidation that had protected environmental criminals for decades. Walter's final public speech at the Foundation's inaugural conference drew environmental activists and legal professionals from across the country. His quiet dignity and systematic analysis of corporate criminal methods, providing both inspiration and practical guidance for communities confronting industrial pollution and governmental indifference. The bronze medal accompanied Walter to every foundation event, David's achievement serving as tangible symbol of the scientific integrity and moral courage that environmental protection required in the face of corporate power willing to use violence to maintain profitable criminality. The community health clinics established with H&W restitution funds began providing medical care and environmental monitoring services to families affected by decades of illegal dumping and deliberate contamination of water supplies. The healthcare infrastructure serving as both practical assistance and ongoing documentation of corporate environmental crimes' human cost. Maya's oversight of clinic funding and operations drew on her forensic accounting expertise to ensure that medical resources reached affected communities rather than being diverted by administrative overhead or political manipulation. The systematic approach reflecting lessons learned from H&W's sophisticated methods of hiding criminal activities behind legitimate business structures. Sarah Chen's prosecutorial work with the Environmental Protection Agency resulted in strengthened regulations and enforcement mechanisms designed to prevent future corporate environmental crimes. Her insider knowledge of industry methods informing new investigative techniques that could penetrate the layers of legal protection and financial complexity that had historically shielded polluting corporations from accountability. The medical evidence gathered by restitution-funded clinics provided ongoing documentation of environmental crimes' lasting effects. The health data serving as foundation for future legal actions and regulatory reforms that would protect other communities from similar corporate exploitation. The memorial service for Walter Hendricks drew hundreds of environmental activists, legal professionals, and community leaders who had been touched by his quiet determination to transform grief into meaningful action against corporate environmental crime. His death from cancer serving as final reminder of the personal cost that environmental justice extracted from those brave enough to challenge institutional power. Maya's eulogy avoided sentimental platitudes in favor of systematic analysis of Walter's strategic thinking and moral courage. Her legal training helping her articulate how one man's love for his murdered son had exposed and dismantled one of the most sophisticated corporate criminal organizations in American environmental history. The bronze medal found its final resting place in the Foundation's Memorial Garden. David's environmental achievement now serving as permanent symbol of the scientific integrity and moral determination that environmental protection required in the face of corporate criminality backed by political corruption and regulatory capture. Pete Morrison's appearance at the service represented the community of ordinary people whose courage and expertise had made environmental justice possible. His law enforcement background providing crucial support during the investigation's most dangerous phases when H&W's security contractors had been actively hunting for whistleblowers and potential witnesses. The landmark federal legislation that emerged from H&W's prosecution established new legal protections for environmental whistleblowers and strengthened penalties for corporate environmental crimes. The David Hendricks Environmental Protection Act serving as legislative monument to the young engineer whose integrity had cost him his life, but ultimately transformed environmental law enforcement. Maya's testimony before congressional committees drew on her unique experience investigating corporate environmental crime from inside the system. Her forensic accounting expertise helping lawmakers understand the sophisticated financial methods that polluting industries use to hide systematic criminality from regulatory oversight and criminal prosecution. The law's provisions for enhanced whistleblower protection and mandatory disclosure of environmental crimes reflected hard-won understanding of the intimidation tactics and violence that corporations deployed against environmental activists who threaten profitable criminal activities. Sarah's work with federal prosecutors resulted in plea agreements and cooperation deals that exposed environmental criminal networks across multiple industries. The H&W investigation serving as template for systematic prosecution of corporate environmental crime that had previously operated with virtual impunity through regulatory capture and witness intimidation. Maya's law practice grew steadily as communities affected by industrial pollution sought legal representation that combined environmental expertise with understanding of corporate criminal methods. Her reputation as the attorney who brought down H&W Industries, attracting clients who had previously been ignored or intimidated by polluting corporations and captured regulatory agencies. The bronze medal's journey from symbol of personal grief to inspiration for environmental justice reflected the transformation of individual tragedy into collective action. David Hendricks's murder ultimately catalyzing legal and regulatory changes that would protect future generations from corporate environmental criminals willing to poison communities for quarterly profits. Rachel Morrison's investigative reporting continued exposing environmental crimes and regulatory failures across the country. Her collaboration with Maya's legal practice creating a powerful combination of journalistic investigation and legal accountability that corporate polluters found increasingly difficult to evade through traditional methods of cover-up and intimidation. The David Hendricks Environmental Justice Foundation's annual conferences became gathering points for environmental activists, legal professionals, and community leaders working to prevent corporate environmental crime through enhanced enforcement, stronger legal protections, and ongoing vigilance against industry attempts to resurrect the regulatory capture and witness intimidation that had historically protected systematic ecological destruction and deliberate poisoning of vulnerable communities. The autumn morning that marked the first anniversary of H&W Industries' collapse found Maya Chen walking through the familiar glass doors of Sunset Diner, the same fluorescent lights and coffee-stained counter that had framed her transformation from failed law student to environmental attorney, now serving as sacred ground where justice had first taken root in the form of an old man's desperate plea. Pete Morrison looked up from the grill with the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in human decency had been vindicated by events that proved ordinary people could defeat corporate criminality through courage and persistence. His investment in Maya's potential having paid dividends in environmental justice that extended far beyond their modest diner's walls. The bronze medal now occupied a place of honor above the coffee machine. David Hendricks's environmental achievement encased in a simple wooden frame with an engraved plaque that read "Courage changes everything. David Hendricks, Environmental Hero, 1995-2023. The tarnished surface catching morning light with the warm glow of redemption rather than the cold reflection of grief. Maya's regular breakfast had become something of a pilgrimage, her monthly return to the diner serving as a reminder of the moral clarity that could emerge from the most unlikely encounters when people chose justice over comfort and truth over safety. The expanded diner reflected Pete's decision to invest H&W restitution money in creating a community gathering place that honored environmental activism while serving the working families who form the backbone of neighborhoods too often ignored by corporate power and regulatory agencies. The new community room hosting everything from environmental justice workshops to support groups for families affected by industrial pollution. Maya's corner booth, the same table where Walter Hendricks had first approached her with evidence of his son's murder, now featured a small bronze plaque identifying it as the David Hendricks Memorial Booth. Though Pete insisted the designation was less about commemorating tragedy than celebrating the possibility for ordinary people to achieve extraordinary justice when they possessed courage and persistence. The morning regulars had grown accustomed to Maya's presence, their respectful nods acknowledging not celebrity, but someone who had used her education and skills in service of community protection rather than corporate profit. Her example inspiring others to consider how their own professional expertise might serve environmental justice, rather than perpetuating systems that prioritized wealth over public health. The familiar rhythm of breakfast conversation and coffee refills provided comforting backdrop for Maya's reflection on the year that had transformed her understanding of how individual actions could cascade into institutional change when guided by moral clarity and scientific precision. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message that carried the familiar weight of someone seeking environmental justice against corporate power. The brief message from Maria Santos requesting legal consultation about industrial pollution affecting her community's water supply, serving as reminder that H&W Industries had been only one example of systematic environmental crime that continued affecting vulnerable families across the country. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Another corporation, another contaminated water source. Another community whose health had been sacrificed to quarterly profit margins, while regulatory agencies looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions and industry influence. The same playbook that H&W had perfected before David Hendricks's integrity had triggered their exposure and destruction. Maya's response to Maria's message reflected the confidence that came from having successfully challenged corporate environmental crime once and understanding the methods needed to repeat that victory for other affected communities. Her law practice now equipped with forensic accounting expertise, investigative journalism partnerships, and federal contacts that could penetrate corporate cover-ups and regulatory capture. The bronze medal seemed to pulse with renewed purpose as Maya typed her agreement to meet with Maria's community. David's environmental achievements serving as ongoing inspiration for legal battles that extended his legacy of scientific integrity and moral courage into future confrontations with corporate criminality. Pete's decision to frame newspaper clippings about Maya's victory over H&W Industries reflected his understanding that environmental justice required not just individual courage, but community support and ongoing vigilance against corporate attempts to resurrect the regulatory capture and witness intimidation that had historically protected systematic ecological destruction. The articles traced Maya's journey from anonymous waitress to celebrated environmental attorney, though she consistently deflected personal credit in favor of emphasizing Walter's persistence and David's sacrifice. Her humility reflecting genuine understanding that environmental justice represented collective achievement rather than individual heroism. Rachel Morrison's investigative reporting had continued exposing environmental crimes across multiple industries. Her collaboration with Maya's law practice creating a powerful model for combining journalistic investigation with legal accountability that other communities had begun replicating in their own battles against corporate pollution and regulatory indifference. The bronze medal served as focal point for these displays of environmental activism. David's achievement providing tangible symbol of the possibility for scientific truth and moral courage to overcome corporate power when ordinary people chose justice over comfort and community protection over personal safety. The memorial garden behind the diner had grown into a contemplative space where environmental activists and community members could reflect on the ongoing struggle for ecological justice, while drawing inspiration from David Hendricks's example of integrity in the face of corporate violence and intimidation. Maya's monthly visits to the garden included time spent at the bronze marker that commemorated not just David's life, but the broader community of environmental protectors who had risked everything to challenge systematic ecological destruction and deliberate poisoning of vulnerable communities by corporations willing to use murder to protect profitable criminality. Walter's ashes had been scattered in the garden according to his wishes, his final resting place chosen to reflect his belief that environmental justice required ongoing cultivation and community support rather than individual heroism. The modest memorial serving as gathering point for activists who drew strength from his example of transforming grief into meaningful action against institutional power. The bronze medal's journey from symbol of personal loss to inspiration for collective action reflected the possibility for individual tragedy to catalyze broader social change when guided by moral clarity, and sustained by community commitment to environmental protection and corporate accountability. Maya's reflection on the year since H&W's collapse revealed the profound personal transformation that had accompanied her professional success. Her transition from failed law student to environmental attorney representing not just career advancement, but fundamental realignment of values and priorities that placed community service above personal comfort and moral courage above financial security. The forensic accounting skills that had once seemed like academic abstractions now served daily in the pursuit of environmental justice. Her expertise in corporate financial structures proving essential for exposing the sophisticated methods that polluting industries use to hide systematic criminality from regulatory oversight and criminal prosecution. Sarah Chen's continued work as environmental prosecutor had strengthened their sisterly relationship while advancing federal efforts to prevent corporate environmental crime through enhanced enforcement and stronger legal protections for whistleblowers. Their collaboration demonstrating the possibility for family reconciliation and professional cooperation in service of shared commitment to environmental protection and community health. The David Hendricks Environmental Justice Foundation's growing influence reflected Walter's strategic vision and systematic planning. The organization's support for environmental activists and affected communities ensuring that individual courage could be sustained by institutional resources and community solidarity rather than isolated heroism that corporations could more easily suppress through intimidation and violence. The bronze medal that had begun as symbol of David's achievement and Walter's grief now served as beacon of hope for communities confronting industrial pollution and regulatory capture. Its presence in the diner's community room, providing daily reminder that environmental justice remained possible when ordinary people possessed courage and persistence, sufficient to challenge corporate power with scientific evidence and moral determination. Maya's phone call to Maria Santos that afternoon carried the confidence of someone who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of corporate environmental crime and emerged with both victory and wisdom that could guide future battles for community protection and ecological integrity. The familiar weight of another environmental justice case felt less like burden than opportunity to extend David's legacy of scientific integrity and moral courage into new confrontations with corporate criminality. Maya's acceptance of the challenge, reflecting her understanding that individual actions could indeed cascade into institutional change, when guided by the same principles that had transformed a late-night encounter in a modest diner into the destruction of one of America's most sophisticated environmental criminal organizations. Sometimes, as Maya had learned from Walter and David Hendricks, kindness and courage could open doors that power never could, transforming personal tragedy into collective triumph and individual grief into enduring justice that protected future generations from those who would poison communities for profit.